So, kia ora again. I'm Moran. I am the director and lead narrative designer for Pathweaver Productions. There's still 2 seats up here if people want them. You can sit in the reserve spot, it's fine. We're a storytelling studio based in Te Whanganui-a-Tara, Wellington. We're making cool stuff at the moment, like a quick play TTRPG board game hybrid. So if you've ever wanted to role play in a board game, we're going to sort you out. And we are also making an interactive fiction game at the moment, so that's us. So you're here to learn about making games that can inspire empathy. And what started this journey for me? Well, we all know that media can inform. We've all learned things from media. And we also know that games are a highly immersive and engaging form of media. They're interactive in a way that other forms of media aren't. And a few years ago, I did my master's thesis in anthropology/creative writing on this space. And at the time, I was sort of thinking, there's a lot of toxic behavior in the gaming world, and I was sort of like, surely we can use games to make the game community better. So I had this desire to make social impact, and this sort of transformed into me thinking about how you can use games to do that. I've done chunks of this talk before, so if you've seen chunks of it at NZGDC or at Play by Play before, I apologise, but I'm sure you don't remember any of it because I don't either, so we'll all cope together. So I had this desire to look at this issue of toxicity, and a lot of it made me think about where does all of that toxicity come from, and thinking about how, you know, we think about Yoda, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate is the dark side. I mean, it's a good line for a reason, right? We have this thing throughout all cultures where we fear the things that are different from us. And it's complicated as to why that is, but one of the reasons I believe comes down to a lack of understanding. So, a lack of understanding. We talk about in anthropology, and I'm sure you will have seen this term before, the other. I'm me, I know my world, I know my perspectives, my friends are like me, my family are like me, my colleagues, maybe even my neighbours. We share common ground, common perspectives, and over there is the other. They are not like me, they have a different culture, maybe a different religion, gender, sexuality, ability. All of these things mean that they have a different worldview and a different perspective to me, and different motivations, and I don't know what those things are. They're strange to me. And that's where some of this fear comes in, because we have a lack of understanding about what's going on in another person's world. We don't know their perspective, we don't know what they're going to do, we don't know what they're thinking, what they're motivated by, what offends them, what makes them angry. And that sort of unknown of how someone else is going to react can be a very scary thing for how humans relate to each other. So, thinking about games and thinking about how they inform, I wanted to see how we could use informing to break down that lack of understanding through lack of information. And this is the model that I built. Don't worry, you don't have to read it all right now. We're going to go through the whole thing. But the basic concept is that we break down the barrier of the other or the strange by involving players in the life of a character. Their challenges, their victories. We make the strange familiar, and by gently drawing the player through the difficulties that a person can face when they're the target of intolerance. And we equip them with tools to operate in situations which might otherwise be something that's totally outside of their experience. The empathy experience is about living as the character, essentially walking a day in their shoes. And if you do remember one thing from this talk, I'd like you to remember the phrase play a day in their shoes, because that's essentially what this model is about. It's about using games to allow people to experience a different way of life. So we leverage immersive principles and use narrative techniques to embed de-othering and empathy-engaging moments in our games. So let's go hard. These are the guidelines, and you may have noticed on that previous slide that we had two principles which sort of sat around the model itself. So the first is, in my opinion, one of the most important elements of any kind of game design which has an educative intent, which is don't let your social issue take over the game experience. Put play first. There's a guy on LinkedIn who I noticed the other day making this comment, David Chandaros. He said, how many of us are still creating content and then coding it in chocolate to get it down? Now, I don't know how many of you in the audience are game designers first and you're just interested in the empathy stuff versus people who are specifically learning game designers, but I hate this when people build learning games and then are like tacking on game design to that. And I just think all of us have had that experience of going into something that you think is going to be fun, but it turns out to be a massive bore. David created this, which don't worry, you don't have to read all of it, but I was interested in his approach where he said, you know, there's a learning chunk, there's a storytelling chunk, gameplay chunk, and a user experience chunk. And he says, for his model, that learning activities are nested within the design and comprise only 25% of the build. Now, in my opinion, and my model is for mainstream games, right? It's not for educative games. 25%, way too much. No. Aim for less than 5%, maybe even less than 1%. It's not really a quantifiable number in the figure sense. It's about the experience. And I'll tell you a little secret. There's a reason why I keep using the word inform rather than the word educate. It's because I think we all have associations with that word. You know, we think about being stuck in school and being bored and being forced to swallow medicine, and I feel for gamers, games being ruined by learning. So in the inverse of that though, I think everybody in this room would agree that we've all learnt things from games. You know, we've learnt politics, history, we've learnt how to jump off high things into hay bales and live. Maybe? How many bullets go in a Glock? We've also learned emotive and narrative things like what we'd be willing to risk for the life of a friend, in theory, if we could come back from our save point. But we do learn things from that experience. And so what's critical, I think, when making games that have an informing element is that aren't serious games, is that we don't forget this essential principle. Be subtle. Don't let your social issue take over the game. Put play at the centre. Principle 2 is positive empowerment. Now, I've had several ongoing arguments with people about this, so it's okay if you disagree with me. But does the experience need to be a positive one? Well, yes and no. So yes, in the sense that we want people to go away feeling positive, empowered, better informed, and with more mental tools for operating outside of stereotypes, biases, and discriminatory frameworks. So what I mean by that is the story doesn't have to be positive, but the feeling of empowerment does, right? So it doesn't have to be, it could be a sad story, it could be a horror story, it could be sports ball, but what you want is to use these techniques that I'm going to go through to leave the person feeling equipped, and rather than feeling hopeless or like discrimination is an inevitable part of reality and it's inescapable. You're not making them feel crap, you're making them feel like their actions will have impact. It's a little bit like election psyops, you know, when they go and say, oh, your vote doesn't matter, oh, the parties are really all the same, they're all bad, so it's not worth voting. That's sort of the way that disempowerment disengages people from things. So this principle is about the opposite of that. It's about leaving them equipped and feeling like they've got more tools in their kite for facing unusual situations and in different ways of life. And both of those principles, the subtle hand and positive empowerment, are both things that you should be checking in on through your design process. I just realised I didn't start the timer, so I have absolutely no idea I've been talking, but we're here. We're just going to vibe. Okay, so we're talking about narrative events first on the first chunk of the model. And when I'm saying narrative events, I'm talking about both the whole story, so the world, the characters, and then also the flow of the story. So the events part is the actual moment that something is happening in your game and how you're enriching that to give it the power to inform. So we've got 4 types of narrative events, and I'm going to go through each one of them. So we've got showing how discrimination occurs, we've got showing the effects of discrimination, we've got normalising diversity, and resistance and victory. And just a little preface before I go into all of these. I did design this model around a case study of specifically sexism and a little bit of transphobia in there as well. So while I can attest that, at least from an anthropologist's perspective, it does work, my thesis advisors were like, what is truth? And I'm like, please don't ask me that question. People liked it. It worked. I haven't tested it for other isms like racism, but I have no reason to believe that the principles aren't transferable, but I just want to be transparent about my process. So, type 1, showing how intolerance occurs. So, we've all heard this phrase, show, don't tell. This is your friend. We are showing the experience of discrimination in this type. So we are not sitting them down and asking them a quiz on what sexism is defined as. We're going through an experience of that type of discrimination happening to them. And more on this them part later. And I recommend, when thinking about our principles, that we use microaggressions as a narrative tool here, because they're both annoying as heck when they happen to you, but also they don't distract from the rest of the game experience in a significant way. So this way you can build up over time a context of discrimination, which will ideally slowly allow the player to see how these things can happen in real life. So I'll give you some examples of this sort of thing. Microaggressions. If you haven't heard this term before, here's a little example. This is a person saying to someone else, I think you would look great in a dress. And they're like, yeah, thanks, that's nice. So microaggressions are a comment or action that subtly and often unconsciously or unintentionally expresses a prejudiced attitude towards a member of a marginalised group, such as a racial minority. So they're a great way to introduce players to injustice for a couple of reasons. As I said, they're annoying. They're actually how a lot of us all experience intolerance in real life. For a lot of us, these small moments are the ways that we're all felt to maybe feel like we don't quite fit or we're not accepted. And they build up inside us and grate on us over time. And as I said before, they're a great way of showing the player, allowing them to feel these moments and have that slowly build up without it being sort of this huge neon, like, here is a bad thing happening moment that's going to distract from the overall play experience. And the other thing that's interesting about microaggressions is that they're largely invisible to the people who are not affected by them. So there will be people amongst your players who have never experienced the type of thing that your character is having happen to them in the game narrative. So macroaggressions are the big version. So they are overt expressions of manifested aggression directed towards individuals. So here we have our person trying to get in here, they have an urgent warning, and then he kicks her in a second, but you can't hear that because it's a GIF, but imagine with me. So macroaggressions are overt, where microaggressions can be covert. They see manifested violence, such as bullying, violent attacks, murders, at the extremes, genocide, and they usually come from this sort of bed of socially accepted microaggressions. Using macroaggressions in your games can be useful, but it's something to use with a really light hand. It's very obvious, so you'll want to have a context and a reason for why it's happening. We're not chucking sexual assaults and murders and things into our games for no reason, right? It's narratively contextualized. And it's often useful to think of them as being a culmination moment or a narrative shift, because in both cases of those things, macroaggression is likely to result in some kind of change in behaviour for your character. If you think about it, something significant and upsetting that happens in a character's life in a narrative usually creates some shift in behaviour. So it's really useful to think about as a trigger moment, if used at all. And I definitely think you shouldn't use these wildly. Okay, type 2, show the negative effects of intolerance. And this GIF died years ago and I can't find the source anymore, even though I made it. So it's just this character reflecting on how sometimes it gets real tough. And intolerance does hurt. And it's about showing that emotion in your character. It's useful for educating people on how toxic discrimination can be and showing the character's development at the same time. So the player sees and experiences the character's pain and the ways the character alters their behaviour based on their experience. And one of the games that I'm working on, we see one of the characters basically hamstringing their own sort of career future because of a lack of confidence caused by the bullying that they've been experiencing. And in that moment, I want the player to appear from behind a wall. I want the player to feel frustrated, not necessarily so much with the character, but with the things in her life that have caused her to basically make a really bad decision. I want that frustration moment to happen in the game experience, but also then be transferable to real life, to kind of spill over when people see how those events can play out in a real environment as well. So it's shown through causal examples in terms of the method. So we've had things occur that are unpleasant, and then there's a cause. It's related to a thing that's happening now to the character in their own inner world. Next one is about normalising diversity, and I think it's reasonably obvious, and we all know how important representation and diversity is, and thankfully we're starting to see more and more of this in games, and it's a wonderful thing. But the key part here in terms of our framework is the word normalise. So in this scenario, we're filling our story with diverse characters, their stories and perspectives. Just a note as we go, please remember to employ co-design principles, involve the groups you're trying to represent, don't design for, design with. And it's shown through diverse characters being present in a narrative, their experiences being validated, and sometimes their perspective being presented as mundane or ordinary to some degree. And this has some pros and cons around it, so I'll just go into that a little bit more. So one way of using this is not having the diversity become a target of the narrative. It's background, it's about making diversity feel normal rather than other or strange or unfamiliar. It's about saying to the player, it's okay to be blank. It's okay to be queer, female, trans, person of colour, disabled, etc. The mundane part isn't necessarily required, but it relates to our design principles of the subtle hand and positive empowerment. It's also about de-othering by showing a thing that might be unfamiliar to the player in a way which helps them to become familiar with them. So in my test game, I did this by having a character where they were gender neutral and they used gender neutral pronouns, so did their family. There was kind of nothing said about it, but everybody was using the correct pronouns. And in one situation in the game, someone new to the village uses the incorrect pronouns and are gently corrected. And that's just like a way I've given an example for the player of something that's normalised, something that I've given them a tool in their toolkit around something that maybe they've never encountered in real life, and sort of allowed that to be normalised. Now, this isn't to say that you shouldn't make diversity a narrative focus if you have a reason for it. Sometimes there's a risk with normalising too much that it can silence the voices of people who experience challenges and experience negative views in society. So, you know, you've got your femshep, for example, a great example of a character who, she's a female, she's a commander, she's a warrior, and it's never mentioned, her gender's never brought up in the story because it's written the same, whether she's male or female in the story, right? And that's really satisfying as a player, particularly as someone who might be not male, because it's like, yeah, it doesn't need to be a big deal, right? But on the other hand, it's like, I feel like we're seeing a bit of a trend at the moment where, especially media that's created about queer people, it's either all about the drama of being queer, or it's just never, like, it's in La La Land where queerness is just accepted in society. And they've got their place, but it's nice to have something that addresses it and also accepts it at the same time. So there's reasons for doing different parts of this. Yeah, can be done without focus, but sometimes focus is good too. Okay, so resistance and victory. Okay, so here we've got a moment of our character overcoming the exact issues that have been facing them in the past. And we talked earlier about the principle of positive empowerment, and this type directly links into that. If players walk away feeling helpless, their empathy building and information building experience is less likely to result in positive change in their own lives, right? So as players in type 1 and 2 encounter issues and react to those, type 4 allows for the character to resist social pressures, whether actively or passively, and potentially have a victory moment where they overcome a negative perspective, person, or experience. And this is designed so that we can allow the player to experience frustration and then move along with the character into a position of positive agency. So it's also fun to just like Hadouken a dickhead into another dimension. So there can be catharsis in this and humour as well. So it can be a powerful emotive experience in your narrative. Now, resistance, of course, it's worth noting, is not always a grand kicking of a jerk. Sometimes it can happen within ourselves, right? So sometimes it can be about not giving up when society tries to discourage you. It could be something like a male character wearing a clothing item that's socially perceived as feminine. It could be going for the promotion even though you know you've got people who aren't backing you. Resistance is sometimes small acts and sometimes big acts. And narratively, it's sometimes useful to think about this as ways to pull your narrative along, right? And so you've got resistance, you've got negative things happening and resistance overcoming them, and that can kind of be a tool in that way. It is important to note that not every negative experience for the character has to be overcome. Just like in real life, we experience negative things all the time, but we only devote our internal energy to pushing back on a select few of those experiences. So the decision to employ type 4 is best made as a deliberate choice in your design process to think of something that is going to be significant to both the character, the player, and ideally this sort of journey of empathy building that we are trying to employ. that's kind of obvious. Cool. We got through our 4. This is just a little tack on at the end, which is consider the wider social themes and contexts beyond just your game. And the example of this that I come across when I was researching my thesis was, minor spoilers for The Walking Dead, like 2 or 1 or something, sorry, block your ears for a second if you need to. They created a sympathetic black character in that game, and then at the end of the game you have to shoot him, right? And the commentary around that is, okay, so you've done well in terms of representation, but have you, we think about things like police violence, violence towards black people. There's wider social themes than just what's happening inside your game, right? So just think about that and make sure, if you can, that you've got social and cultural advisors involved with the design process. You think about where you're involving those people in your process, and make sure that you get feedback on your test games. Okay, so we've gone through these, showing how it occurs, showing the negative effects, normalising diversity and resistance and victory. So let's go into the second half. Actually, have a little breath and stretch with me, because it's a long time to sit and listen to someone talk. How are we doing for time? We're okay. All right, so one of the key ways that games are special about this and causing an empathy building event to happen is, as we've seen, the events happening in the narrative, but also through how entangled the player is in the game experience. So I like to use the word entanglement rather than the word immersion, simply because I discovered in my research that although we all kind of understand what immersion is, we actually have, especially in our different subfields, kind of different approaches and thoughts about what immersion is and how we would consider a player to be immersed, right? If you're a sound designer, you've got a different impression of immersion than you do if you're a writer or you're a UX designer. And you guys may have heard of game flow before, or flow, or I like to call it in the zone. That's that feeling of being fully immersed in the game and concentrating on it, feeling like there's no barrier between you and the game. It's worth noting that flow can be a form of immersion, but it's not caused, but flow doesn't cause immersion. It's the other way around, right? So I like to use the word entanglement rather than immersion because it's kind of a loaded word. And I like to think about how each layer of this helps to entangle the player more in the game experience, right? And so it's like the more we can entangle them and emotionally involve them, and sometimes physically involve them, then the more likely we are to have a big impact, right? So I'm going to go through each of these, but we've got observation leading to participation, sensory immersion, physicality, acted embodiment, digital embodiment, game story immersion, cognitive immersion leading to personal narrative, sociality, agency and choice leading to consequence, and leading to personal responsibility. Don't worry, you'll live. We'll get there. So, observation and participation. So this is that first moment when someone first encounters a game. I'm talking about walking past it out there and going, oh. I'm talking about your Steam pages. I'm talking about watching a friend play it and going, what's that game? Seeing an ad, a Twitch stream. Any of these moments can activate curiosity, which then starts to be the first thread of entangling somebody in a game, right? And then they shift from being an observer to being a participant. And I use the word participant because we have this thing about who the player is, right? But we all know, we've all been there, when sitting next to somebody on the couch while they're playing the game, they're holding the controller, but you're saying, oh, there's somebody with a knife behind you, or you're saying, go open that chest, you haven't noticed it. In that situation, you're a participant. You are actually one of the players in the game experience. And I use the word single player to get the phrase single player together when I was doing my thesis, because I think a lot of the time we're playing single player, but we're actually playing it in a collective way. So they can become the player in that situation. Sensory immersion. So I love telling this story from the designers of Zelda, who said that they wanted, Breath of the Wild, they wanted the player to feel like they could smell the environment. And I just think that's such a great quote, because you think about how they're doing that through the visuals, the sound, the way that your feet sound different depending on whether you're on grass or sand, and the bugs are different, and all of that stuff that they've done, and the light to make the senses be immersed in that experience. Minecraft, a great example. You can feel claustrophobic in real life as you're wending your way into a dark tunnel. These sorts of games, like sensory overload, and it's definitely like designed to have a lot of sensory stimulation when you're winning, so it's kind of building your feeling of feeling good. Physicality and acted embodiment is the haptic relationship between the player and game. So that's the physical link between you using like a controller or making your body into certain shapes, and it links the body with the game, right? And that's that entanglement moment. Some games just involve the hands, but others involve the whole body, like DDR, and of course VR brings in a whole extra layer into this type of immersion. There's a great games researcher, Helen Kennedy, who described games as a cyborgian artifact, where in order to become itself, become a game, and not just an item, it requires a player. And she described this process of us joining with games as the collapse of boundary between human and machine. And I really liked that concept of how it's actually the interaction between the human and the player that makes games what they are. So it creates a cyclic relationship, of course, because you're doing something with your body, it's making something happen, which then makes you do something with your body, which then, so it's this sort of relationship between you and the game. Now, digital embodiment is through a combination of sensory, physical, and emotional immersion, where the player can experience their avatar or in-game presence becoming a form of digital embodiment, which can enhance their personal connection with the character's game world and space. So when your player feels like they're immersed within the game, you start to have this collapse moment between yourself and the technology, right? Where you start to feel like this is happening to yourself. So that's when people start using the word like, I did this, I got hurt, or I can't believe that happened to me, or damn, I died, or ouch. These sorts of terms where people have just lost a little bit of their emotional separation between that game world and their self, and they feel like they're there, they're in the space. When we think back to our narrative events that we were talking about before, digital embodiment is one of the really key parts of the framework, because it allows the player, especially if their own empathy towards others in life might be a bit middling, to feel a sense of personal impact. So offence, anger, frustration, guilt, sadness, victory, righteousness, all of these can become a reflexive experience when encountering others in real life, when they've had this sort of embodiment in the space. Now, perspective and point of view can create different impacts here. I don't have time, so I'm just not going to go into that. So think about how you're embodying the character in the game in different ways, and how that can create different impacts in terms of the story experience. Game story immersion, we've kind of gone over most of this already, but the story leads to emotional engagement with characters, plot, and world. We are natural storytellers as human beings. It's very easy for us to go into simulation through play and story. I think about how children will role play as mermaids. Even though they've never been a mermaid, they can embody that in themselves and through the narratives they're telling to themselves. So, it can activate that empathy moment through the narrative. Cognitive immersion and personal narrative. So this sounds techie, but it's actually not that complicated. It's about the sort of game part of the situation. It's the mental engagement with the challenge, the doing of the game. So this is when your brain is saying, I'm trying to puzzle this out in some way, and that's another form of this entanglement moments. An important element in here is thinking about types of gamers and types of fun. Which I'm sure most of you will have encountered before, but here's just some examples. Things like whether a player experiences fun and plays the game to collect every item in the game, or whether they play because they want to fight the hardest boss in the game. There's different ways that people engage with the game, and when we're thinking about entanglement, we want to think about how many of these we can engage in our game design, right? Obviously, not every game will do all of them, but it is good to think about, I think, particularly when you're in your early design phases, which of these you're ticking off. And if there's a simple, because sometimes when you're not really thinking about it, especially if you're quite immersed in your game's mechanics, it's quite easy to just be focused and you can miss a couple of these that actually wouldn't be that hard to incorporate. So it's just good to think about this in your process. Now, sociality is a really interesting one to me because we all know that gaming can be and usually is a social experience in some way, even if you're just playing solo and then talking on the internet about who you're romancing in Baldur's Gate. You know, it's still a social process for us. And it's quite interesting to me because I think game designers only have oops, I've gone backwards. Only have control over parts of it, even though it's so significant to the game experience. So think about the fact that sociality is what often draws people into games. You see other people playing a game and you're like, oh, I'm into that too. And it can also be what draws people back if they've stopped playing your game. And obviously there's all of the added layers of immersion and social enrichment and bonding that we get when we play multiplayer games. It can add competition and collaboration, which are both types of gamers, so those are things that are useful entanglement moments. And as I said, they're kind of enabled by the game, but they're operating outside of the game. Choice is critical, and what I mean here in the agency and choice leading to consequence and leading to responsibility is choice allows players to feel like they matter, like their decisions have impacted the story world, right? And that's that thing of consequence together with choice. They feel like this world is experiencing consequences based on my decisions. And so then they are part of that narrative. And in my opinion, choice is one of the most useful tools for involving a player in the story world. Emotionally, I mean. And one of the things that's interesting, and this was pointed out by a researcher, Catherine Isbister, great book, by the way, Emotion by Design. Because of choice, we can have games that have unique experiences that you can't get in other media. So players can feel emotions like pride or guilt because of their decisions that have impacted the story world. You can't get that when you're watching a movie because you aren't involved, right? So it's really, really helpful for this entanglement process. So those are all the immersion types. Last thing quickly is remember that you don't have the power to mind control people, because otherwise I'd be worried about evil governments using my model to spread evil. You can go through this whole process and people can still just go, nah, that's dumb, and not engage with it, which in some ways is kind of a safety valve because it stops you from accidentally harming somebody without meaning to. But yeah, it's just good to remember that people can always just disagree with you, and that's okay. So here's our model. We've gone through this whole thing. We've got our principles, we've got our narrative events, and we've got ways we're entangling players in the story world and their experience. And let's just think again about this diagram that I shared with you. We've gone through our desire to make an impact. We've learned how to use games as an informing site, immersion site, and how to use a framework. It's not the only way you can do this, but it's one way that games can inform users and inspire empathy. As I finish up, I just want to share a part of the diagram which was part of my research. This part here, making change in society. Obviously, for me, I would like to see a kinder world where we can all treat each other better and where we don't have to be afraid of people who are different to us. So my dream for myself is to make games which can, at least in some small way, have a positive impact in society, and I hope that if you want that too, that maybe I've given you some useful tools. So we have to be out of here in 10 minutes, but if there are any questions, sing out. Yeah.
You mentioned that your gender doesn't matter in Mass Effect, but it does affect your romance.
It does, right, yes. So the question, if you didn't hear it, was your gender does affect in things in Mass Effect in the state of your romances. And yes, it does, and that's one of the only ways that it does, which is kind of interesting. Like, I'm still mad that I wasn't able to romance Tali, but I guess that's that flip side thing of sometimes having it matter is also part of the story world, right? Yeah, I'm still mad about that, but anything else? Okay, you're free. Thank you for listening.